The law is a key driver in workplace inclusion. If you look at parental leave policies, for example, they differ across the globe depending on a country's requirement and regulation. In some countries, it even differs by state. So if we know this, how is it that we aren't looking at all the other ways that government can impact our workplaces? Should we be putting more pressure on governments for workplace inclusion instead of always putting the onus on founders who have 10 million other things to think about at all times? To discuss this, we have a fabulous panel. We have Philip Salter, who is the founder of the Entrepreneurs Network. Wow, these just moved down. The Entrepreneurs Network is a think tank based in the UK. They look at a variety of things, but they've been doing a lot of work with government on female founders, and I've been working with them to chair the Inclusive Innovation Forum, which looks at how do you get more funding into underrepresented founders in the UK, and should we be using government money for some of that? We've got Natalie Mets, who is the nightmare of Tallinn. When I say nightmare, I mean the mayor of the night. She is also the founder of a period poverty company, which I'm going to try and say in Estonian, so please forgive me. It is Päevad ja ööd, which means day and night. If there's any Estonians, please don't kill me. Not terrible, apparently. And then we've got Roann MCCLOSKEY. She's a facilitator at Fearless Futures. It's an incredible diversity organization that do workshops across the UK and across Europe, really focusing on how corporate companies can make their workplaces more inclusive and what work do they need to do to get there. Very practical stuff. And they'll be moderated by an incredible writer and journalist who I've been so pleased to meet this week. That's Christopher Kissane, and I will invite them all on stage now. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to Anissa for that lovely introduction and for putting together these fabulous panels this morning. I think it's so important that Latitude this year and indeed last year has placed such an emphasis on discussing issues of diversity and inclusion and impact, because for all of the amazing stories about startups and entrepreneurs that we find from all sorts of different types of people at these events, it can be very depressing sometimes to see still how unequal the tech world in particular is. I mean, I'm from Ireland. There was a report in Ireland about the gender pay gaps this morning in our different sectors, and the tech sector had the worst pay gap of any, even worse than finance. And given that in Ireland we have the headquarters for Europe of all of the major tech giants, it shows that even the industry leaders have like a lot more work to do. So we're going to be talking a little bit today about whether or not we need to be putting more pressure on those companies, on people in the industry, in the sector, or whether or not the government needs to take a more active role and take responsibility for making a sector that is so vibrant and contributes so much to the economy and to the way that our society is changing, more representative of the societies that it serves. So I'm very pleased to be joined by these three fascinating people, and I hope that we're going to have a really wide-ranging discussion. I'm going to start off by asking about a political issue that's been bubbling around this over the last year, which is the issue of quotas. The European Commission has been pushing for a European-wide directive on forcing companies to have at least 40% of their boards being from underrepresented genders, so mostly from women. And many countries opposed the idea of that being a European-wide thing, including Estonia, where more than 90% of members of corporate boards are men. It's the second worst in the whole of the EU. But the European Parliament has reached an agreement on that, so we are now going to have quotas introduced across the EU from 2026. So I want to start, Natalie, by asking you, because Estonia still has such a big gap at the top level of corporate boards, and indeed the second worst pay gap, gender pay gap in the EU as well, what do you think about quotas? Do you think that they can be effective, or do you think that they're a very blunt instrument?
Yeah, so those things you name, these are just two of the things that are really bad, but there's way more. For example, I think now we have the biggest female members in the parliament we've ever had, and I think, I'm not quite sure right now, but I think it's like 30 out of 101. So when it comes to quotas, then in principle I am pro, but I also feel that it has to be executed really well, meaning that we still have to be able to choose the best candidate. Yeah. Otherwise, like we all know, it can just have the absolutely different and bad effect. And my background before I went to politics is in music industry, and music industry is also one of the industries which is really male dominated. And I was part of this platform empowering gender minorities called Key Change, which then collected different organizations to sign a pledge that by 2025, perhaps, their lineups will be 50%. And now working at the festival myself, also being the co-founder of the local community radio, I see how it actually works when you have this task or you have this pledge that you have decided that you want to have more diversity, and then when the internal wish and drive is also there, then it actually only has great results.
Yeah, I guess it harks back to something that people were talking about in the two previous discussions about the idea that often people are there, qualified people are there, and they're being overlooked for structural reasons. Philip, I wonder if I could ask you about the situation in the UK, because the Financial Conduct Authority have recently introduced stricter quotas about women on boards in the UK, but I think I saw an article that 7 of the top 10 companies in the UK failed to meet that, and are going to be fined. So companies don't always necessarily do what they're told, and often if the fines aren't big enough, then they don't care. But how do you think the difference between kind of mandated quotas and the kind of industry targets that Natalie was talking about interplay, and what kind of success do you think that they've had in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of quotas work. I think if you look at countries that have introduced quotas, like France has 45%, as you mentioned. The UK has gone from 12% of non-execs to 40%, so there's been a big change. So I think on net, quotas definitely work. They kind of focus minds, and I think that's a really important kind of way. As was said earlier, it's important just to have those targets, because if you're running a business, there's so many different things that you can focus on. So putting that higher up the agenda is really important. I think smaller companies, I read a report literally just yesterday from the Quoted Companies Alliance in the UK, and I think smaller companies have some kind of pushback against it, and I think that's kind of a natural thing and it's to be expected because it's more challenging for them, but I don't think that's any reason to not have quotas as long as it's not too strict and there isn't a kind of full rebellion, because then we won't get what we want. But I think one thing worth adding is there's probably a reason we're focusing on non-execs. Non-execs aren't the center of a business, and it's kind of an easy target as well. So in the UK, FTSE 100's 9%, so 9 have CEOs that are female-led. So there's a reason we're focusing on non-execs. I think that's a good thing, but we need to think of other areas where we can make a difference, where we can actually kind of lead to sustainable change. Because if you just focus on the board, it's not where the center of power is in the world.
I saw a very interesting report about consultancy and accountancy gender pay gaps in Ireland, and how at most of the senior management levels, the salaries were about the same. But when you looked at the partners were overwhelmingly male, and they were getting huge bonuses that were not being given to senior female staff. So actually, it was kind of a hidden gap, as you say. The difference between non-executive and executive pay can be very important. Roann, through Fearless Futures, you meet all sorts of different types of business people. And I wonder what you learn from them about the importance of the representational power of quotas, or even just of the makeup of corporate boards and C-suites. Like, how do you think that businesses see the importance of looking diverse? And is it really just the way they want to look, or do they actually want to change the way that their businesses work?
Yeah, I think that's... At Fearless Futures, we work with every type of organisation, whether it's governmental, tech, banking, charity sector. And so this conversation comes up a lot in our programmes. And I think quotas and targets absolutely have a power and work to an extent, but from our kind of design thinking and anti-oppression pedagogy, we're always going to further interrogate, right? So sure, you have a quota, but some things to question about it is that quota and target intersectional? So if we're saying we want 40% women, which women are we saying that we want? And are we specifying and codifying that to ensure that we're being intersectional and therefore actively welcoming rather than further marginalizing, which can often happen when we go with like siloed thinking? Also, as you say, is it reputational for an organization? Is that why they're doing it? And also when we think about, okay, so if we've met 40% women, that's our quota, and we've met it, are we then going further and looking at where in the organization are those roles being held? And are we just looking at junior and support and admin roles, and then that's it? And then what does that mean for our leadership? And what does that mean for the rest of our thinking? And also, there's loads of interrogation when it comes to quotas and targets. Thinking about, is that being paired with a structural and cultural shift within the organization, right? So are there educational pieces? Are policies being redesigned and changed to meet it? Because what we have with a lot of organizations is, well, we've met a quota or we have a diverse pool that we employ, but retention is very low. So quotas, I think, work to an extent. I think they're really good for the D in EDI, but they don't access and speak to the equity and inclusion piece.
That's a really interesting
right?
way of thinking about it. We must come back to that issue of cultural change, because I think that's really crucial. But I want to just focus for a second on that idea of intersectionality, because it is interesting that a lot of the policy push that has been coming from the Commission across Europe is around the issue of gender diversity, which is obviously very important, but there's very limited policy push about any kind of racial or ethnic diversity, despite the fact that the ethnic makeup of Europe has changed enormously in the last 20 years, and corporate world in particular, the tech world, certainly doesn't reflect what, say, the average 18-year-old population around Europe looks like, which is now much more racially diverse. Philip, in the UK, I mean, it can be very hard as an Irish person looking across the Irish Sea at the UK in the last few years not to see a sort of, it's like that bit in The Simpsons where Sideshow Bob just keeps stepping on the rake and it keeps hitting him in the face, like a country that has been sort of stumbling from crisis to crisis politically since Brexit, with many, many different prime ministers, many different governments, and so on. How do you see the policy landscape around these kind of cultural issues? Because there does at times seem to be a bit of a culture war about some of these things, whether it's racial diversity, gender diversity, other types of social and cultural issues in the UK that have become very highly politicized. Do you think that that's impacting on what hopefully would be a push towards greater diversity?
Yeah, I mean, clearly there is, in the UK, as there is in the globe, seems to be this kind of, let's call it kind of woke, or let's call it whatever the right term is, versus a kind of reactionary pressure. And in the UK, we are seeing the reaction. I think in other countries, you're seeing it, obviously in the US, most obviously. And I do think that the reactionaries are kind of losing overall, though. I mean, you walk into most companies, I don't think anyone is speaking openly, having really terrible views, and I think that is a positive thing. But that said, there's huge amounts of kind of missed opportunities that we're just not kind of getting behind. So a good example of that was an incredible report called Lost Einsteins that came out from the US, and it looked at kind of wealth inequality, which obviously intersects with lots of other things. And it found that the top kind of 1% of income, you're kind of 10 times more likely, even if you're an incredibly smart kid, so you've won like these maths challenges, like much smarter than I ever was. If you come from the top 1%, you've got like 10 times more chance of becoming successful, becoming an inventor, as they call it, versus the bottom 50%, which is an incredible statistic. So we're just leaving money on the floor, effectively, as a society, and that goes across the whole world. So I'm optimistic that truth ultimately wins out. But as we kind of heard in the panel, I caught the tail end of the previous panel, things like not having tights the right skin color and makeup for the right skin color, that was leaving money on the table, and that we leave on the floor, and we'd been doing that for years, for decades and years. So even though I'm optimistic in the long run, there's a huge amount to do in the short run. But I think if there is a culture war, I actually think that progressives are winning the culture war, and I think that's probably that's obviously a good thing.
We hope that all of the heat and light is not necessarily indicative of the direction of the debate, but it's tiresome and frustrating nonetheless. You make a really interesting point there about educational attainment, and I guess something that strikes me a lot is the difference between policies that are specifically geared towards EDI, like quotas or something that's very explicitly to do with that, and wider social policy that actually affects a lot of these things, whether it's education or healthcare or things like that actually affect a lot of the structural inequalities in our society. Natalie, how do you think that the difference between those things plays out in politics? Like things that maybe have a huge impact on the kind of inequality that we see in the workplace, whether it's to do with access to healthcare or the type of healthcare or type of working arrangements or education and things like that that maybe aren't explicitly EDI policies, but actually impact very much on underrepresented groups in the workplace. How do you think that those things play out politically?
Well, when we talk about Estonia, then we haven't had a lot of immigration, so we can't really we can't really talk about race. But what we can talk is Estonian Russian-speaking people, and there definitely is a huge gap, and education, better work positions are more accessible for Estonian-speaking people. But another huge problem, especially in Estonia, is the general gender inequality, also meaning that it's actually pretty difficult for an ambitious woman to have both career and family, meaning that we have really generous child care mechanisms. The mother can stay home for 1.5 years and she will get paid and all that, but actually instead of, so money is not what is going to make ambitious young people get more children. What they need are services. For example, good childcare at the university or at the workplace. So when talking about examples, then this has also been an issue or like a topic for a long time, but for example, parliament or local government could show and bring a really good example by creating, a childcare at the work space or so. So this is the family and work balance is something we still need to work with a lot.
Mm-hmm. That idea of leading by example is quite interesting when it comes to cultural change, I guess, because you need to be able to show the way things are done differently. Roann, in your work with different companies through Fearless Futures, like how do you show good examples of positive action that people can follow rather than just replicating the structures and expectations perhaps that they have brought into the workplace from what are still very patriarchal and often misogynistic and racist societies?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of our pedagogy is, our longest program, which is called Design for Inclusion, we look at redesigning policy and not reproducing the structures that exist societally. So within an organization, you can have your own ecosystem, right? You don't have to kind of follow what else exists. Examples of really positive redesign have been a company who their interviews used to be that you would come in for a day to be interviewed. And so something that they redesigned was to ensure that you would have your expenses paid. And by looking at that and through the strategy that we offer to redesign policy, they were able to see that they had opened the pool so much, whether it was to single parents, whether it's to people from a low socioeconomic background, right? You're starting to really open out a pool by those sort of actions and measures.
It's interesting how even small things like that can make a big difference. And Philip, like through working with entrepreneurs, we heard a lot in the last two panels about the kind of small things that can make a huge difference on people trying to break into a market that really wasn't designed for them and in many ways was designed to exclude them. Like, what do you see when you look at entrepreneurs coming from underrepresented groups who don't maybe have network contacts, maybe don't have the type of cultural capital that is expected by wealthy investors and so on? Like, what kind of things do you see that have worked in terms of as policies, in terms of encouraging more entrepreneurs to be able to be successful?
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you what doesn't work, I suppose, because we, in the
that's
UK, we have one thing that we're kind of working on at the moment is around the British Business Bank. So British Business Bank is a pretty good organisation. It kind of funnels a lot of the money into venture capital. The venture capital industry is still kind of not diverse at all, that there's some kind of legacy issues there that they're trying to overcome, but ultimately that's a pipeline issue. But the real challenge here and the way they could impact policy and really open things up is there are a lot of kind of emerging fund managers, but for reasons that kind of make sense, the British Business Bank doesn't want to take risk on emerging fund managers. I'm talking about kind of black fund managers or funds that focus on specific minorities or groups. And they actually don't focus on, they're happy to focus on location, so they're happy to focus on the levelling up agenda, as it's called in the UK, and there's probably equivalents all around the world. but they're not happy to focus on female founders or ethnic diversity. We think that as long as the portfolio of what they're investing in is diverse, then having a particular fund manager or fund that's focused on that would be really useful. So I don't really see the problem being at the entrepreneur stage. I mean, there's obviously hustle that anyone can do to build their own network and all of those sorts of things, but given that there are still lots of things that the government can change, I would be loath to kind of say, this is what you need to do as an entrepreneur, because it's not a level playing field yet.
Yeah, well, I guess there's an interesting question there about where we draw the balance of responsibility between the private sector and the state. I mean, I would imagine from this conversation that we've been having that we all think that there is responsibility on both sides, but there is a question of where that responsibility lies, because I guess there's a difference between the government mandating things or the government nudging in particular directions. Natalie, if you could think of like small individual policies that you would want to see changed in Estonia that would make a big difference in terms of making workplaces or encouraging workplaces to be more accommodating and inclusive, what would that policy be? To put you on the spot.
I'm sorry, I'm not going to answer that question in the way you wish, because I think that what Estonia especially needs is a real big shift in mindset.
Okay.
Because it is still really like male dominated, and maybe when we talk about policies, then yes, perhaps quotas is the policy we need, but this is not small. Like you said, like agreeing on quotas and then actually also implementing them, it's a really big step, which also needs very good explanation and communication to the society, because it's still so biased.
And in a country that now has a woman prime minister and recently had a woman president, like, how can you change a mindset that is still so patriarchal? Is it through leading by example, or is it something that basically men need to take more responsibility?
Well, I would say that when it comes to our prime minister, who is giving a speech right now, I think, then the conservatives are trying to paint this picture of her as an incompetent leader because she is a woman. So there's like simultaneously two narratives being created. One of this like actually great leader who has done so much for the whole Europe this last period of the war, and then the other narrative being like, look what she has done, she's always away, she doesn't care, blah, blah. So it's also important to then the other government members to kind of know how to like balance those two narratives. But I want to bring an example of our former president who happened to be a woman, and she told a story how this, 4 or 5 year old boy approached him and asked whether boys could also become president, because in his mind, he only remembered, or for him, a president was a woman. So this already shows that if we have examples like this, then this is already change. I'm sure that there are loads of young girls right now who wish of becoming a prime minister because they don't know what the work actually means. And also, when we talk about Kaja Kallas, then she has brought a lot of women to her government. So the last government, I think there was like 7 women and then 8 men, which is also like a first time. So, yeah.
It's really interesting how you can sort of, the kind of innocence of a child can reveal how pervasive a lot of these structural inequalities are and that pervade the kind of toxic nature of misogynistic and patriarchal culture. Roann, when you tell stories and try and do activities and discussions with people in business about these type of things, that mindset shift that Natalie was talking about that is so vital, probably more vital than any policy that any government can come up with, how do you encourage that mindset shift? Because it seems it can often be so deep-seated, especially in certain sectors, like the tech sector, that it can be very difficult to shift. How do you approach something that is so fundamental and so structural in a lot of different sectors?
Yeah, I mean, the cultural shift and the mindset shift, right, goes hand in hand with policy, and I think often gets ignored. You think about Section 28 in the UK, for example, coming out of play in 2003, but the day that happened, there wasn't like every gay kid didn't come in being like, woohoo, it's all fine, right? Nothing gets communicated and unlearned. And so that's what we do. Part of our pedagogy is understanding what we go really macro. So really thinking about what are systems of oppression, how do they operate, how are they designed on purpose to maintain power and disadvantage certain communities. We look at 9 systems of oppression, and then we look at how do we then have the tools with which to disrupt that. And within that, that is the mindset shift. That's the unlearning of what is so insidious and so ingrained in our society, because that's part of how, policy and structures are one level of it, ideas and what societally exists in behaviors and conversation is the other. So disrupting them both, ideally at the same time, but one with the other is great, is how we do it.
And what kind of reactions do you get? Because, I mean, a lot of the language that is necessary to dismantle these things is that we need to talk about structures of oppression, we need to talk about misogyny, we need to talk about patriarchal culture and so on. I mean, those are not necessarily concepts that you expect, venture capitalists or old male CEOs to take seriously in the way that Philip was talking earlier about the kind of culture war against dismissal of woke ideology or whatever. Like, do you get positive responses when you talk like that with businesses who want to change, or do you sometimes get people who are like, we're just doing this because we have to?
Yeah, I think lots of different. There's often a lot of resistance in our programs, but resistance in a way that actually, because what we are talking about, what we're seeking to disrupt, is really challenging. Our frameworks and our language and the pedagogy is so powerful. It sounds so complicated when I speak like this, but when it's within the context of learning, everything is defined and explained. It's so robust. There are frameworks and strategies that really give a precision, actually, because sometimes it can feel so overwhelming and so sort of complex and messy. And that precision can give such clarity to be able to be like, what's the next step? What's the next step? And regardless of sector, people really show up in a way that's quite transformative.
That's interesting. Philip, I wonder, in terms of working with entrepreneurs and as a think tank that is in the business space, in the previous 2 discussions, a lot of people were talking about how these issues don't need to be framed as like social goods. It's also something that is good for your bottom line. Now, I guess there's a question there as to which story you want to tell and whether it's a tactical or a strategic decision. Like, do you find a difference in how business responds to saying, well, if your company is more diverse, you're going to make more money, and your company shouldn't be perpetuating structures of inequality?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's different stories for different people, I would expect. I mean, I think because we work in the world of entrepreneurship, I think a lot of people are already kind of bought into this on a kind of in a public way, but kind of coming back to some of your kind of question you brought up before, we did a piece of really interesting research where we talked to the founders of, female founders of really high growth businesses. So these are people who'd mostly raised tens or hundreds of millions, but all of them had raised over £1 million. And we asked them loads of questions, but including about their home life. And these female founders, who are all really incredible, all of them, they were twice as likely as male female founders to do the majority of the housework at home. So kind of coming back to your how do you change society point, there's still things that are happening, even things like that, which are just kind of ingrained in all of us, and require people to shift over time. But I think it's also a generational thing. So my colleague Aria, who did that research, she was surprised by it because she's much younger than me. She's like half my age, and had, in her mind, that was just mad that the world was like that. Whereas I was kind of sitting between that and my parents. And for me, it just seemed, that kind of makes sense to me, because that's a world that I kind of grew up with. And obviously, in the middle, trying to shift towards being kind of better in that way. So I do think I think everyone's on a journey, I guess is the way to describe it. And I think you just catch people in different ways. And yeah, sure, the economic stuff works. If you look at, there's loads of research by people, Deloitte and others, that show that makes a difference, and more innovative companies are more diverse.
all on different journeys and at different speeds. And Natalie, I'm going to give you the last word since we are here in Estonia. And I wonder if I could just ask, do you think that Estonia takes that mindset shift that you see as so fundamental seriously?
I mean, to make the shift, we have to decide to make the shift. And we ourselves have to be the change. And if we decide to do, then yes, the mind shift will happen.
Okay, that's a very inspiring note to end on. Thank you very much to the three of you for joining me. Thank you all for coming. And thank you to Anissa for putting forward this, this great selection of panels this morning. I hope you enjoy the rest of Latitude and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot for the panelists. One more time, guys, round of applause. Thank you.